we've heard from students there, but let's change tack again and go back to listening to a really important perspective. And this is about the back end of education, of the international education sector, the kind of infrastructure that makes things work, that connects all of us. So we're now going to go to a very important and topical session around the future of virtual conferences. But before we do that, I believe I have a poll to launch. So we're going to ask you some questions first of all. Obviously, all of us, many of us had been advocating for more sustainable forms of travel, more virtual recruitment, virtual events for some time for environmental reasons, but the pandemic has kind of brought that to the fore. So first of all, we've got a set of 2 questions here on the pros and cons of virtual conferences. The first one, what are the drawbacks? You can choose multiple answers, technical difficulties, video conferencing fatigue, keeping your focus, the fact that poster sessions don't work quite the same way, networking is impossible, and other. If you can think of any other possible options, please put them in the chat. So we've got about 40% of you have voted. We'll give you a few more seconds so that we can get some more answers in. It's looking like video conferencing fatigue is edging ahead at the moment and keeping your focus. And that's something that we've certainly been very conscious of at CANIE as we've designed these events to try and make sure they were interactive and short and snappy. But with that, we are aware how hard it can be, and there are a number of virtual events at the moment. Okay, we've got almost 2/3 of you have voted now, so we'll stop that poll there, and we can share the results. So yeah, keeping your focus, it seems to be the hardest part, followed by fatigue on 55%, close in second place. Networking at 43% is then seen as quite a drawback. And obviously technical difficulties can be a problem too. All right, so now let's look at the other side of the coin. And I'd like to ask you about the biggest value of virtual conferences. So can we launch that poll, please? Oh, we already have it, sorry. Okay, so we can see here that sustainability with lower carbon footprint for everyone is the #1 choice. 81% chose that as the biggest pro. The next one is accessibility, 79%. So that's obviously, there is a democratizing aspect to this. And the flexibility and multitasking. All right, so that's an interesting set of answers, which I'm sure will be unpacked by our next speakers and panelists. So I'd like to now go to straight into our next session on the future of international conferences. Will they go back to, snap back to face-to-face when the pandemic is over? Will they stay virtual, or will we go straight to hybrid? Who knows? Let's ask Evelien Renders and her panel of experts.
Welcome everyone to the session about future of international conferences. My name is Evelien Renders and I'm an information manager at Radboud University. Let me first say that Teun and I will be available in the chat to answer your questions during our session. And also we will have a 5-minute live Q&A after the session and the panel.
Good. My name is Teun Bousema and I'm a professor in the epidemiology of tropical infectious diseases. Welcome to our seminar. Conferencing is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Hundreds of thousands of academics travel across the globe to attend conferences. We academics travel a lot. I certainly do. In the last decade or so, more and more academic studies have appeared on the carbon footprint of this conference travel. and sometimes with uncomfortable messages. A contradiction in my field sparked my personal interest. I work on malaria and global health is closely intertwined with the climate crisis. At the same time, there are multiple conferences each year on malaria and global health. The travel to these conferences may have a substantial impact on global warming, thus exacerbating the problem we seek to solve. To appreciate the scale of the problem, I calculated the carbon footprint of the most important conference in my field, the meeting of the American Society for Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. I received information on the state, province, or country of origin of all conference participants. With this information, I determined the most likely airport of departure, the busiest local airport, and then determined the most plausible route with the fewest stopovers using an online travel planner. I conservatively assumed only economy class travel and no air travel for anyone within 500 kilometers of the conference venue. This approach allowed me to calculate the total distance along a great circle path, and using the mean direct and indirect carbon emissions from 3 different sources, this allowed me to calculate the CO2 equivalent emissions for each flight. With this approach, I estimate that the roughly 4,800 participants of this single tropical medicine conference traveled nearly 45 million kilometers, the same distance as 58 return trips to the moon and back for a single meeting. The carbon emissions equal the total emissions of more than 9,300 US households for a week, a small US town for a week. In an opinion piece, we contemplated different options to reduce this carbon footprint that we felt was unacceptable for a single meeting. We discussed options like a biannual conference, slashing the travel by the obvious 50%, hybrid virtual and in-person conferences, and decentralized conferences. The latter option is potentially interesting. If for this conference 5 locations were chosen and all participants would travel to the nearest venue, this would reduce emissions by nearly 60%. In preparation of this summit today, I calculated the carbon footprint of travel to the 2019 APAIE conference on diversity and inclusivity in higher education in the Asia-Pacific region that was held in Malaysia. The 2,500 participants from all continents traveled a total of 35.7 million kilometers to and from the conference. This distance equals 46 return trips to the moon and the emission of an average 9,900 European households for a week. The conference location, remote for many participants not coming from Asia and Oceania, contributed to this large footprint. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, in-person conferences have been put on hold. Whilst many academics may eagerly await the next conference on an attractive location somewhere on the globe, virtual conferences have become the standard for the time being. The conference organizer from Leiden, the Netherlands, organized a poll among 513 Dutch academics. This poll was held early this year, before the lockdown, when few of the academics from all of the ranks already had attended virtual conferences. About a third of the participants of this poll attended 3 or more conferences per year prior to the COVID pandemic. Some of the questions to these participants focused on what they expected from in-person conferences. More than 80% of the respondents indicated that inspiration, hearing new knowledge, receiving input on their work, presenting this work, and networking with known and unknown colleagues are important or very important reasons to attend conferences.
Now, several months later, many academics have had their first experiences with virtual conferencing. But what is the experience so far? In an initiative supported by the Radboud Green Office, we interviewed conference participants and organizers on their experiences with virtual conferences. What worked? What frustrated? What was unexpectedly good? For what elements do we have to go back to the drawing board? In nearly 10 hours of in-depth interviews, several common themes emerged. One of the advantages are, in addition to the sustainability, of course, is the accessibility of conferences. Some conferences offered subtitles to Francophone speakers, presentations were often available on demand, and participants were able to see more presentations and ask more questions than with in-person conferences. But there are also challenges. Participants found it much harder to stay focused. Sitting behind a computer makes you less engaged. I'm really curious what you are experiencing right now. And whilst oral presentations worked quite well, poster sessions are much more complex. Some people were hesitant to post a PDF of their poster online, and the interaction was often quite difficult. That interaction was by far the most challenging bit of virtual conferences, because you do not bump into old friends, and how do you meet new people? How do you get a vibe of being together when you are separated from your peers by a screen? As we're wrapping up this part of the presentation, we are wondering what your experience is with virtual conferences so far. After this summit, there will be a live networking event in Zoom, in which you can continue the conversation with your international colleagues. But first, now we go to the panel. Welcome to the panel discussion. I'm here with Shannon Wolff and Louise Kinnaird and Teun Bousema, and we'll be asking a few questions about virtual conferences. So I'd first like to give the floor to Shannon to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, my name is Shannon Wolff. I am an Agent Relations Manager with ICEF, based in Germany. And ICEF is the leader in business-to-business networking events and services for the international education industry. So our events, which we have dozens of throughout the year, bring together international education actors. So the student recruitment agencies, the educational institutions, and businesses that provide other services for the industry. And the events are held with one-on-one, back-to-back meetings over about 2 to 3 days.
My name is Louise Kinnaird. I'm the Director of the APAIE Secretariat, which is the Asia Pacific Association for International Education. We run an international education conference annually in late March. The one coming up will be just a very small update event, not the full conference. And then our next physical in-person conference will be in Vancouver, not until 2022.
We have two people very experienced with virtual meetings. So from this organizer's perspective, do you think that the digital conference is here to stay?
Yes, it definitely is. Up until now, we've had it as an optional item when people would request, can we attend virtually? And the answer was no, because a big part of our annual event was that it is in person, because there's a big social interaction part of it. But I think from now on going forward, we will have no choice but to include a virtual element or a hybrid conference.
Yes, I think it's the same here. They're definitely here to stay, whether the organization's making it their primary platform or if they're alternating, creating hybrid events. We were actually meant to have our first hybrid event last week for our largest conference, our Berlin event, but of course things changed with COVID, and we had to move it back to completely virtual.
And how many people am I thinking then? Like how many people in person, how many people?
So our largest event, Berlin, is typically about 3,000 attendees, and our virtual event that we just had 1,500. So it's half, but it was actually more countries participating, so we reached a wider audience and people who normally couldn't go, which is good.
Do you see that as an advantage? Because it's sometimes mentioned by people attending conferences that the access, and sometimes even mentioned as the democratic process, just being able to participate increases. Is that also your experience, Shannon and Louise?
Yes, I think it opens up a much wider audience to us. And particularly to those who probably can't afford the travel side of it. It opens it up a lot wider to a broader audience. And also for us, we were almost getting too big for some venues. So it means that by having fewer people attend in person, it opens up the options of where we can actually hold the in-person part of it. The feedback that I've had is that networking at the moment doesn't necessarily work that well virtually. However, there is a lot more developing in what can be offered. So it is coming, it has come a long way, and it will continue to move in the right direction. Our event has a very big cultural element, so a very big social and cultural element, and I'm not sure that we will be able to transfer to the same extent into the virtual space.
The one thing that we have heard the most is that people do miss the spontaneous networking, the coffee breaks, the lunches, the parties. Let's be honest, that, you know, these are some of the best times to make connections with people and network. I think that there is potential for it to be easier, maybe virtually. It's just something to work on, because some people feel more confident behind a screen, where standing in a room and, oh, I need to go talk to somebody, what do I do? Not everybody's comfortable in those situations.
For us, for the next event, we are purposely marketing it as not the APAIE conference in virtual format. The other part on that is we have the option to pre-record some of the presentations and perhaps release them the day before, so people can actually see them and think about their questions, perhaps even submit questions ahead of time, because we want the focus to be really on the Q&A part. We need ways to engage the virtual audience for that brief time that we've got them. Here we are, we're all just heads on a screen. But if you're pre-recording something, obviously it depends on your budget for the production, but you could do it more like a TED Talk style, where you have a couple of camera angles, you know, switching between the person in front of their slides behind them, et cetera, et cetera. So you could make it more like a TV production, depending on your budget.
I'm actually a little bit afraid that people will go back to in-person conferences by the masses, just because it's what we've always done, it's what we're used to, we know how to organize them. I mean, how do you even organize a hybrid event where you have people in person that are feeling connected because they're in person, and then you have people behind their laptop screens trying to get in there? Do you feel this friction also, or is it just me?
You have to present, you have to approach it differently. So obviously they're two different events. You're presenting the same event, but in two very different formats. So you actually have to organize them as two different events. Your comms to those who are attending in person and your comms to those who are attending virtually are very different. So you have to make sure you maximize that experience of your two very different audiences. That's the challenge. Some professional conference organizing companies do one side a lot better than the other. So now they have to be able to do both sides of this one event equally well, with their very different audiences in mind, to maximize the experience.
I would add, I think it's super important that in this year, especially for us, speaking personally, I don't think that we were thinking as much about the climate impact. But this year, like for many people with moving virtually, we automatically reduced our carbon footprint, you know, by like 99%. And it's allowed us to look at, okay, what really makes a conference and event successful? And I think this has given us the space to realize how much of an impact it has and what we can do moving forward. So not necessarily completely cutting out in-person events and conferences, but, you know, moving hybrid, looking at things that aren't necessary anymore, because we've seen that they're not necessary to be successful.
So things like that, again, it's a learning experience. You know, we put these things together. You can't think of every scenario and every question, but it'll be interesting to see how this space develops and how far we take it over the next couple of years, because I think it will continue to evolve very quickly.
This was a wonderful conversation. So thank you both for being here and speaking to us virtually in this panel.
Well, that was really wonderful, and so wonderful that we are bringing back Evelien and Shannon and Teun. Thank you so much. How are you guys doing this morning? Thumbs up, everyone.
All good, yes. Good afternoon. Good evening.
Good afternoon. Fantastic. So I am just going to start off by saying there's some interesting conversations happening in the Q&A. and the chat. So I'm really excited to see that happen. And I will also say, Shannon, I am very much a big, huge fan of virtual ICEF. If I never go to an ICEF again in person, I'm still very much able to do my work. I have found the engagement to be incredibly more profound and impactful, and the outcomes have been great. And obviously the cost savings, we've been able to just attend more. So they did not pay me to say that, by the way. That was just, I wanted to sort of come in and sort of start this off. And have you heard that feedback as well in terms of institutions? And is the feedback different from agents?
Yes, I think it is slightly. I mean, this was just last week that we had our big Berlin event, and we've had a few smaller ones before that, and so we're still kind of gathering all the feedback. But I think overall, we have gotten a lot of positive feedback, just like you, that it's potentially even more productive, that you can be more focused, you can schedule more meetings. But across the board, and probably especially with agencies, do we hear that there's missing the same energy and the networking and kind of the buzz that goes along with the in-person events.
Great. So on the agent topic as well, and we're going to take just a few more minutes here for the Q&A. But on the topic of agents, we often hear that they want the university rep in market to lend that additional credibility. So what are your thoughts on what institutions can do and to give agents the same status and credibility they got from when they were in person, and what you're seeing in terms of their willingness and openness towards more virtual student facing events and incorporating reps that way?
So are you asking about how to get students in more virtually, or just to embrace it in general for agencies to embrace it?
Have you found that the agencies have embraced it, and you're seeing in the last few months their willingness to do that more?
As far as actually providing a more virtual platform for studying, yes, it has grown. There was, of course, initially a lot of hesitation and skepticism on online programs, but in general, that has grown, especially as people have done it more and as institutions have shown that they do a good job of it, especially over some time. As far as the networking events, yeah, a lot actually do prefer it. It gives them more flexibility. They don't have to spend the money on travel. And quite a few agencies were able to attend that don't normally, or maybe they have more than one person who can go instead of just the one that always goes every time. So we had different people getting exposure to the events, which is good.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And this one, Evelien, you did such a great job moderating that discussion. So this next one is for you. When it comes to the participants in this event today, what sort of next steps would you recommend in sort of wanting to take actions in their own institution?
Yeah, so I can really relate to this question, because I think a lot of people might have the feeling of being like, but what can I do, So what I always say is just spark this conversation within your institution. I think that's truly the first step, and it may sound very easy, but if you think concretely about, perhaps you could connect the information managers at your institution, who are people working in IT and with business IT alignment, and connect them to your green office. Because if your information managers always have this sustainability in the back of their heads, they might see a presentation from the green office and they might share experiences. This conversation really sparks new sustainable ideas that can be implemented. So it is still important to have the digital virtual coffee chats and organize a presentation and invite your colleagues.
Wonderful. And I've seen you guys be engaged on the Q&A section here, but I will bring this to the forefront, and Teun, you engaged here as well. But there's conversation around sort of virtual reality and sort of figuring out networking. So I'm wondering if you can sort of talk a little bit more about that, share your thoughts and experience building on the question that Ellie asked in the Q&A.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. How can you make sure networking actually works? I have my largest conference next week. Again, this American Society for Tropical Medicine, and actually the participation from Africa is better now than there was ever before, and actually also many finance organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They said now you don't have to spend on travel. Spend it all on making sure that all the participants from low resource countries can actually go to this conference. So I think in that sense, it can really improve accessibility. That the networking is challenging. I think Zoom is not very good for networking, at least not big groups. I will have my first networking event tomorrow with an avatar. So I'm really looking forward to that. I still have to pick my avatar. But I think these things are developing. I think sharing best practices is really important. And I think the other thing that could really help, and we calculate some of these decentralized conferences, you can imagine you would have conference hubs where actually you have VR possibilities. And if people would all travel from East Africa to Nairobi instead of to Washington, DC, that would have a phenomenal impact. And you can still have the networking in the region and also by VR, perhaps internationally. So I think this is really an exciting field of new developments.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'm really excited to check out the, networking event after this. We're all getting new to this. I think in the chat, Daniel had mentioned that this is all very new for us, and it does increase accessibility. Shannon, you talked about people just being comfortable behind the screen and perhaps more comfortable engaging there. And I think that that's really powerful. And then also, I think we can all agree that there is benefit to not, this is what sort of Daniel had mentioned, just like not wandering around the room with like a glass of Diet Coke or champagne or whatever you're into and like awkwardly looking at name badges where you're able to like specifically reach out. So there certainly are a lot of benefits, and notably in terms of the accessibility and sort of the evening out of the comfort level for some people where it might have been much more that barrier.
Yeah. Absolutely, and we tried to address this networking a bit, and I know we have more work to do on it, but we did have dedicated times for joining a networking lounge where there weren't other meetings already scheduled, and there would be ICEF staff in the room, and then we would hold breakout sessions to discuss topics or just chat. And I saw business taking place or just kind of getting to know people, and it's not the same, but it actually kind of equalizes the room a little bit and lets you introduce yourself and stand out more than perhaps in some cases in person.
And I'm certainly hoping to prove Teun wrong about Zoom and networking, because he's never been to a networking event that I hosted. So
wonderful. And with that, I just wanted to thank you guys all one more time. This was a really important discussion. I think there's so much more to talk about, and I'm really looking forward to it. So I'm sure we'll discuss this further. And with that, I will sort of hand it back over to Elsa. Thank you so much, everyone.